I'm Paresh from the LA Times, Rob. So I thought we'd probably start by explaining a little bit about what exactly the Hyperloop is and sort of how it works. And you're telling me that you've sort of proven out a lot of the concepts on a small scale. So what are some of these key things that make up the Hyperloop, and what have you already sort of worked out, at least on a small scale?
We can start with the concept that transportation can occur in a tube. That tube can be a very controlled environment. It's impervious to weather or other disruptions. And inside that tube, we create a low-pressure environment. We reduce much of the pressure because that reduces resistance of an object that we move through that tube. So if we ever remember standing in a metro station or a subway station and you feel that big gush of air comes down before a train comes in, that's actually because a train is pushing a very large column of air through a tube, through a tunnel. So we reduce the pressure. We are then able to put a pod, think of a capsule that contains a container, a freight container, or people. And we levitate that pod not on wheels, which are pretty efficient up to around 300 miles an hour, but then begin to lose their efficiency. It's a great concept that was invented a long time ago. But we levitate that pod off a surface, and you don't have any friction. So now we have very little resistance because we're not pushing a column of air. We have very little friction because we're not dealing with the friction of wheels. We can basically go above ground, so we significantly reduce the right-of-ways and very small footprint. So when you do that, you get a couple of results. First of all, you need much smaller right-of-way to create a very fast transportation system. We can go above grade. We can use existing right-of-ways. I think in the area of the LA River is having huge potential as it's reimagined and redeveloped. You can go underground and perhaps follow freeway right-of-ways. The energy consumption is dramatically reduced because, quite frankly, you use an all-electric motor to propel that pod inside the tube. You only need a fraction of the distance actually has to have the motor. You don't need the whole distance to be electrified. You use passive systems so that you can actually minimize the amount of energy. It's all electric. There's no noise pollution. No one wants to have a loud transportation corridor go past their backyard, and that's often why it takes so long to create a project. But when you're not pushing air and you have no friction, you make no noise. So the whole idea is very elegant. Our company was formed in June 2014. A year ago, we were in a garage. Today, we have 120 people. We're raising the money to make this happen. And it's actually a very, very exciting thing to imagine that a fifth mode of transportation could evolve, which, in effect, helps us solve some of the challenges we've been discussing here today.
So how much of this sort of... So how much of this actually works already? I mean, levitation, has been tried in sort of many transportation concepts, but and it works in other countries. But how much of this have you actually proven out?
So the concept, and many people are familiar with maglev trains, magnetic levitation, popular in Japan, now in China, in many places of Europe. Those systems actually, you need energy to levitate. You use energy to levitate. And some of the systems we're looking at from innovations that actually exist would allow us to actually create levitation without energy, just a passive system, which the movement alone creates that. So we're doing some testing on that right now in our labs here in the Art District in Los Angeles, and we'll be proving those out as we move forward to a full-scale test later this year. The big test we're doing is a propulsion system, which is actually what you use to move the pod with either a freight container or with a pod with people. You propel that inside the tube. We're actually beginning the test of that full-scale system. It's a custom-designed synchronous motor. It uses only electricity to create that movement, and those tests will begin in the next 60 days, and we'll be probably demonstrating some of that live on live streams as we begin to really demonstrate the first full-scale deployments of the constructs of Hyperloop in the world.
And you're building this test site in North Las Vegas, and it's mainly so far through money that you've raised from venture capitalists, right? But you're going after funding right now from all kinds of people, and you said that it would sort of people would be, pretty excited and amazed by the people you're raising money from. Why is that? Who are you sort of getting on board right now?
Well, everything we're doing is privately funded. And what we're doing simultaneously is demonstrating the concept of the technology. The cool thing about Hyperloop is we're not inventing any new science. We're actually redeploying science that exists today to solve this transportation challenge. And one of the things we are very focused on is to demonstrate at full scale that Hyperloop's a reality, because it sounds so kind of out there that everybody perhaps would think this would take a decade or 5 years. And actually, we're going to do that this year. We're going to prove a full-scale system, 3 kilometers, running at very high speeds, with all the aspects of this innovation working.
In North Las Vegas.
In North Las Vegas, in 50 acres of property we've acquired there. As I mentioned earlier, we have 3 acres in Los Angeles where we have 120 engineers, brilliant people from all sorts of industries that are actually solving the problems and designing the systems that will allow science to actually solve transportation challenges in ways we've never thought possible, speeds we've never thought possible. So we have tremendous investors. We have investors from around the world. I would tell you that people from around the world are extremely excited about this construct. They really do see and appreciate what high-speed transportation has meant for economic development. I think we heard that from Secretary Fox this morning, that we all have to recognize that the infrastructure that we have in the United States isn't up to scratch, and he said that very politely. But I would tell you that if you think about Hyperloop, you should actually think about what broadband did for us in the internet. Because until we really got the high speeds we have today, you simply couldn't use your phone as a video streaming device without the power that mobile broadband brought, and we wouldn't have assumed that everything we take for granted at home would have happened. That happened in 20 years. So actually, I think Hyperloop is like the broadband for the movement of people and things, and we do need a faster and much more quicker infrastructure available in the United States and around the world, so investors actually get this and say this could be one of the biggest opportunities in a new technology perhaps we've seen in a few decades.
But you say that there's hope, excitement around the world. But I mean, here domestically, I mean, you look at the challenges and struggles of getting high-speed rail going. How in the world is a Hyperloop project ever going to come to the U.S. where it actually connects 2 cities, not just a 3-kilometer test track? I mean, it just seems impossible to get something like that. So,
Paresh, I come from the internet world for 20 years, and so I don't come with
Cisco.
with Cisco. I don't come with any preconceptions as to how difficult this is to happen. But I would tell you that assembling huge right-of-ways is a tough issue. There's people in this room that actually know much more than I do about how difficult that is to assemble a very broad right-of-way. A high-speed rail system needs, about 75 meters, maybe 90 meters, including 2-track safety, access roads. We're talking about meters of right-of-ways. We're talking about reusing right-of-ways that exist today. We're talking about why not go beside the freeway, which already has clearance areas? Why not go above the train tracks? Why not go beside or underneath the LA River or in the Alameda Corridor? So really, for people that are here that are experts, they realize that transportation projects usually take a long time because the right-of-way and corridor issue is a very complicated one. And actually, I think by having a much simpler, smaller footprint system, we can make things happen in years instead of decades. And we are absolutely looking for the first projects in the world that, along with developing the technology, we could begin to create some demonstrator projects starting in 2017 that actually demonstrate the full capabilities that we're discussing here, the new broadband for the Internet of People and Things.
But you really think some of those demonstrator projects could happen in the U.S.?
If it was freight, I absolutely think we could.
Why freight?
Well, I don't think you have the same certifications that are required. We are building a safety and test site Clearly, the issues of safety, of movement at very high speeds are important regardless of cargo or freight. We just heard from Google about autonomous cars. Everything about Hyperloop would be autonomous. You're creating pods moving quickly in sequence down a tube. You'd be using autonomous sensor-based transportation networks that'd all be automated. We see truck systems already running in Europe that have trucks running down the road in close sequence very, very safely. So that whole idea of packetizing transportation, not creating great big long trains that need to be loaded and offloaded, but creating individual components that move only to their destination, it's actually a big idea. So I think we can make this happen much more quickly, and I think reimagining existing right-of-ways to be deployed in a way that really solves the problems we're faced with and really takes a stab at improving traffic and really takes a stab at creating demonstrations of the economic impact that Hyperloop can have. That's actually what we're focused on concurrently with developing the technologies, is looking for the best projects in the world. And I would have a hypothesis that one of those could exist in Los Angeles.
So those freight systems, I mean, will that be the first sort of wave of Hyperloops across the world, or just in the U.S. because of safety reasons, more likely freight is first, or across the world?
Everyone in the world cares about safety, and we care about safety as well. The certifications required of the systems that will be required by regulators, the regulators actually working with us to create new rules. I mean, a Hyperloop, is it a plane? Is it a train? Is it a car? Is it autonomous drive? It's all of those things. So we certainly don't want rail rules that were written a century ago for a much different time in the world to be applied to a new technology that doesn't have the same requirements, doesn't have a driver, it doesn't have those things. So we need to work with regulators to help us actually create the same kind of rules that have been developed for autonomous driving. And we're going to do that in the US, and we'll do that around the world. Our view is that in the US, that there's a tremendous opportunity to improve the efficiency of the movement of freight. And certainly Secretary Fox, Department of Transportation, really does see that as one of the big issues that we can solve. And I actually believe that right here in Los Angeles, we could build a demonstrator that shows the power of Hyperloop by offloading much more quickly the containers that are being offloaded in the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and finding creative ways to create a new corridor and move those goods to intermodal distribution areas where instead of driving on the 710 and creating increased traffic, we can do that distribution and intermodal movement of goods somewhere else. We are talking around the world with port operators who are already imagining the idea of an inland port, a dry port, where the activities that happen on dockside today could actually happen somewhere else. And land that may not have the same value as land has when it's sitting on the beaches in the most populous city and urban area in the United States, that land could perhaps be deployed somewhere else, where it's more efficient for trucks and trains to pick up cargo and containers. And wouldn't it be cool if in only a couple of years we could alleviate the amount of traffic on the roads from containers and actually just put them in a Hyperloop? So actually, I do think in Los Angeles and the entire region, that's a possibility. And if people are interested, certainly we would like to obtain the counsel of those that have tried for a long time to solve this problem. And we will not accept that it's going to take 10 years to make this happen. I think we could make this happen in just a couple of years if we reimagined and were creative and had government support and the support of people like Mayor Garcetti and Mayor Garcia to make these things happen. Then I would just ask the question, why not? Why shouldn't we be able to make this happen?
And on the international stage, I mean, do you see Hyperloop projects more likely coming to sort of the first rung of world powers like China and India, and those countries sort of just paying you to build that for them? Or do you see it more, Hyperloops more likely, short term coming to the next rung of countries, the Indonesias, South Africas, and those sort of other growing markets?
My instincts tell me that there are places in the world who like to have a reputation as innovators. In the Middle East, in the Gulf region, in Singapore, places that want to be first. And somebody's got to be first. If you're going to build something new, somebody had to be the first person to fly a plane. Someone had to be the first person to actually ride in a car or a driverless car. So there are places that want to be first. The only question I would ask would, why would we invent the technology in Los Angeles? Why would we have the most severe traffic problems anywhere and not want to say, why don't we try this first here in a demonstrator mode and prove to the world that we can build not only the technology, but solve the kind of problems that are actually the city sees first before other cities in the world. So yes, we'll find innovative countries and cities around the world that are actually extremely interested in what we're doing, but I would say, I think it would be a real pity if we didn't give a full push in Los Angeles and the region to try to make it happen here. We have 120 people. We'll have 300 people here in the next 18 months, and then we'll have 1,000 people here. So we're creating jobs, we're creating innovation, we're leveraging the fantastic universities and the brilliant minds here. It'd be a pity if we didn't take a stab at it.
But regardless of where it's built, who's going to pay for it? I mean, do you see the countries, the countries that want to be innovators having enough money to really sort of pay for the initial projects?
Well, if you look at who's going to pay for it, clearly public transit, the metro systems, the bus systems, high-speed rail systems are typically invested in by the public. Freight systems are typically invested in by companies. And agencies, the ports, and the Port Authority, and the ecosystem around that. But I actually would expect that the efficiency that we could generate with a Hyperloop for freight here or elsewhere would be entirely funded privately, because the economics would make a lot of sense. And what we'd really need from government isn't so much the money, we'd need the support to take really silly regulations and say, why aren't we able to do this when it's sitting right in front of our face? And that would be the thing we would ask for, is real fast tracking, something different than what we have today. Because everybody's talked about this and tried to solve the problem, and it hasn't worked. So let's try something different. And I don't think we're asking for money. I think we're asking for support.
So before I turn it over to questions from the audience, I mean, is there some thorny regulation right now that you're really trying to get rid of? Or is there something in particular that you feel like is standing in the way, whether it's in the US or internationally?
I said I was an internet guy, so actually I can look out there and see people who know more about thorny regulations than I probably ever have imagined. And I think that the attitude that we need to embrace here is why? Why is that off bounds? Why can't we do that? And in fact, it certainly shouldn't be this will take 10 years to come to fruition. That to me would cause us to go somewhere else and do it somewhere else. And the question was?
Answer the question. The question is, what regulation specifically do you find looping? And why are you here, bringing it up?
Just talking about new technology, sir.
Nothing wrong with regulation.
Absolutely.
All right?
Yep.
Then what regulation? You just said that there were unusual, strange regulations. What regulations? I'm just getting a lot of hype from you. I'm not getting facts. What regulations are standing in the way of?
Well, you're not sure, right?
Yeah,
That's
so-
the issue.
Okay, so let me tell you what I believe would be a way for us to make this happen more quickly is existing corridors. The LA River, which is governed by the Army Corps of Engineers, is got a great big project that people are imagining the redesign and the naturalization of the LA River system, which provides a tremendous corridor. It's actually a very unique thing that exists in very few other cities. Working across boundaries with the city of Los Angeles, with the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, typically takes a very long time to imagine anything different that happens in the LA River, because that's a very highly regulated environment where change. I've got a little stream that runs behind my house, and when somebody tried to affect a corner, it took 3.5 years to get a little bank fixed on the stream that runs behind my house in California. So reimagining transportation corridors is something that I think would be really, really powerful. But often what happens is there's a set of rules that people have to follow, that take a certain amount of time that would cause people to imagine they might do it more quickly elsewhere. So probably we totally believe in regulation. Regulations keep this building upright. Regulations keep us safe. It's the speed with which those regulations can change sometimes happens faster when people really just sort of say the question, just say, let's do this, and they get behind that idea. And that's actually what we think we'd like to see here, was fresh thinking with regulators, fresh thinking about how we form capital for transportation. I don't think it's always a public issue, and it can often be a very clear economic issue that we can solve, make more money, make the ports more efficient, offload more container ships. That's great for everybody. It's great for the economy. The more people send their freight through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, today it's 40%, the more vibrant the economy is here, and the more they don't bypass this port because they're waiting in the bay to offload. And as we heard today, those container ships are getting huge, 18,000 containers on a new container ship. So getting them to move very quickly is good for the economy. So I'll be very candid. It's getting people to think differently about how regulations that are purposeful could be modified. And the government, the DOT actually really pushed it to think about how driverless cars and autonomous driving could fit inside the Highway Act. So that's the kind of thinking we're discussing. Yeah.
Any other?
Let's have some. Let's have a.
Any other fresh questions?
Please wait for the mic.
We're currently spending approximately $80 billion to build a high-speed passenger train between San Francisco and Los Angeles. I'm curious about the cost of a Hyperloop, and do you think that the high-speed train might be obsolete when you're comparing it to the Hyperloop that you're talking about? Thank you.
So the cost of creating a Hyperloop for passenger systems that we've been working on and designing that would have a couple of differences and would be cheaper. We've been working with KPMG and other very well-known accounting firms to validate our cost structure, which requires smaller right-of-ways, smaller land acquisition. Clearly, because we would probably build a high-speed rail system off the ground, we have a much lower environmental impact. We disturb only a portion of the land rather than all of it to create a very smooth and wide track. We'd probably be about 60% based on today's cost structures, 3 times the speed of high-speed rail. We'd be very energy efficient because we only use a proportion of the tube is actually electrified. Only a proportion of it requires the movement and application of energy. It's not the first project that we would take on, to be very transparent.
What would it be?
A California high-speed rail system from somewhere in Southern California to somewhere in Northern California. I think we're looking to take on demonstrator routes that would perhaps solve the problems of time. And it's really funny, distance isn't the big issue. It's time. And every time we talk about traffic in Los Angeles, how long did it take you to? It's not distance. It's 16 miles from my office to Santa Monica. And it all depends on when I leave as to how long it takes. It's not the distance, it's time. So the problems that we solve are time, not just distance. And from a reality perspective, I think the first projects we should take on would be less complex, less expensive, easier to demonstrate in the short term than a massive project that currently has a budget of $80 billion.
What's the smallest distance you could go and make this?
It's all about time. So 30 miles, 40 miles. The distance, I think, from the ports to the rail yards is 28 miles. The distance from some other ports we're looking at to their potential inland port is 50 miles. The distance between 2 airports that could be connected. And we've actually heard about airport connections and how jammed LAX is. So is London Heathrow. And people talk about building a new runway, which is a great big deal. If you could make another airport that exists today part of the virtual terminals and you only go 30 or 40 miles, but you go real straight, real fast, it's just like taking a train in O'Hare between the terminals. It would take minutes to move 80 or 90 miles between Gatwick and Heathrow and Stansted, and you could create a virtual airport that isn't a large distance but actually feels like it's one location. So it all depends on time. Cross-city travel takes hours sometimes. And there's one big concept here that we haven't actually talked about, and it's very important relative to how inclusive we can be with Hyperloop and how many places we can stop. If you take something going fast and it keeps stopping, it eventually goes slow. If you take something really fast and you never stop, it's not very inclusive, and you don't get a lot of community support because you didn't stop at my town. You didn't stop in the middle. And the problem with high-speed systems today is they start and stop, so you never really get the benefits of high speed. Hyperloop is different. The pod only goes to where your destination is. Think of an elevator in a high-speed tower where you push 63 and you only go to 63. And the doors open and you're at that new location. So the basic construct of Hyperloop is we don't send 1,000 people at once in a train. We send 50. We don't send a long train formed with containers. We send 1 or 2. And then those containers can go directly to the destination that they're targeted for. So the actual idea that we're packetizing the transportation construct at very high speeds allows us to have more endpoints, more stations, without stopping all the time. And the stations are very much smaller than you need for a big train. Anybody here from the rail business would know that trains need platforms. And the bigger the platform, the more real estate you need. When we go to airports today, we go to shopping centers because we have to have something to do while we're waiting for our plane or it got delayed. So we have massive shopping centers. Ours would be more like a metro stop where your Uber car, your driverless car picks you up and you have an end-to-end transportation experience. So the answer to your question is I think there's a possibility for us to augment what's happening in high-speed rail, but right now it's not the first project that I think that our company should take on.
Next question. Oh, wait,
Hi.
Mike's back there.
Can you hear me? Hi, my name is Marcella Ayala with Ferrovia Agraman. I would like to see if you can comment on, you've acknowledged the challenges that Hyperloop faces with right-of-way acquisitions and permitting regulation, environmental clearances. But there's also a big challenge, I think, that needs to be acknowledged, which is unique to California, which is in building a high-speed rail, and any rail in particular, it needs a relatively flat surface in order for it to function correctly. What about the Hyperloop? Can you go through mountains? Do you need to bore through mountains as you do in California? So the estimated cost for the high-speed rail in California from San Francisco to San Diego is about $68 billion. Fairly large distance. In Dallas, there is also a high-speed rail being proposed right now from Dallas to Houston, $10 million. The difference, significant difference, is not only distance but also a flat surface, no terrain to have to bore through.
So the question is about terrain challenges?
So the question is, does Hyperloop face the same challenge with terrain? Do you need a flat surface, or would you have to bore through tunnels to be able to reach from San Francisco to San Diego?
So at really high speeds, let's say 700 miles an hour, flat's really good. Straight's even better. You don't have any dynamics like a train that says you can only have a grade so much with Hyperloop, but for people, we don't like to do the alley-oop at the top of a curve. None of us like that feeling, and we can't get away from the realities of G-forces. So here's the specific answer to your question. If we need to tunnel, the size of the tunnel is a fraction of the size required to push a train through it. Because when we build a tunnel, the pod fits very nicely and snugly inside that tunnel because we're not pushing a column of air. It just makes sense. So the cost of tunneling is significantly reduced. When we get to urban areas, we could go underground. You can dig a straight tunnel from Palmdale to the center of Los Angeles and just go straight instead of trying to to do anything else. So tunneling is actually very good, and it's an economic advantage of Hyperloop because the tunnel size is much smaller, because you're not pushing a column of air because of the nature of the system that we're building. You can have elevation changes. If it's freight doesn't get sick to its stomach if it has a big curve at the top, so we can actually make some of that happen. And the G-forces that we'd all experience at very high speeds should be nothing less than the feeling of accelerating in an airplane, or even the feeling you may not have when you actually accelerate in a high-speed elevator. We'd like to be able to create an experience that feels more like an elevator ride than anything else. And it certainly isn't going to be an amusement park ride where people's hair is pulled back and everybody's going, that was great. That's the kind of human reaction we often get to moving quickly. So grade is, we have more variability in grade, but if we have to go through a tunnel, the cost is a fraction.
Question, blue shirt.
J.K. Drummond, Southern California Transit Advocates. I'm wondering if any of the engineers or anywhere in the world there are factories that are still using another type of tubular transport system, that old department store system. I'm sure you're going to have problems with switches and so on that probably they have solved. Are there any of those guys left or any companies left?
So I'm not sure if any of them are left, but for anybody here that studied transportation, tube-based transportation is not a new idea. There have been tubes built under cities and postal corridors and tunnels, and I mean, tubes aren't new, nor were they new when I was a kid and they put the cash in it, it went up into the sky and the lady who dealt with the cash sent it back. This isn't new. What's new is the science that exists today being deployed in a way that no one's ever thought possible, the energy elegance of the construct where it's all electric, and actually applying this to both freight and people is the new big thing. And I would say there's probably some smart people out there that remember the tube-based transportation, but the PhDs and the Masters of Engineering in Aeronautics, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers that are working at our company are pretty smart people, and I think they're doing something really fantastic, and I'm excited when it comes true.
I think there's time for one more question. Here in the front. Wait for the mic.
My question is about getting a container into a tube that runs through on a path that's only meters wide. How would that be accomplished?
Well, if you think of a container, big cargo container, 20-foot equivalent unit, probably the diameter of that tube would be 19, 20 feet in the tube diameter. The pylons that tube sits on would be 3 or 4, 5 feet wide. Think of a single, I mean, I was driving to the airport to LAX the other day, and there's a big freeway that ramps up in big tall columns. The pylons would probably support that tube above the ground, so the footprint on the ground is very small. You have right-of-way access. You don't interfere with level crossings. There's no crossings required, because you don't have to condition every single foot of ground as you do in a traditional rail or metro system. Every piece of the surface needs to be conditioned.
My question was more about the width that you spoke about of the path.
Right.
That the tube
So imagine 20 feet's the tube.
It's going to be just a few meters wide. Why, if you're moving containers that we now use through the tube, wouldn't the path have to be as wide as a train path is, which would be, what did you say, 60 meters or so wide?
75, sometimes 90 meters.
So why would the tube path be less wide?
So just imagine that I had a concrete pylon, and a tube that's on top of that concrete pylon, and I can create something like a freeway overpass that's raised above the surface of the ground. So the interference that we have at the ground level is actually very small. You could build, and I'll just say this, imagine we had a rail line that was an existing right-of-way, and we could build something that looks like the McDonald's arch over top of that, and then have the tube suspended over top of that. So it's a much narrower right-of-way that's required to suspend a 20-foot tube above the ground, or to dig a tunnel beneath the ground, or to use an existing corridor, than it would be to create an entirely new, very, very significant transportation corridor. And I think that's the point. I respect some of the questions, and probably have to leave right now, but I'm very pleased that we generated a bit of an excitement here at the end of the day. And between the mics and some great questions, I want to thank you all very much for having me. Thank you.
And how, I was just going to say, when do you think the first project is going to be up and running?
We'll start the first project next year. I hope it's here. And we'll probably complete the first 3 demonstrators for production by 2020, 2021. So for those of us in transportation that think this is going to happen in 2 decades, we really want to change that thinking, make it happen just a couple of years.
Cool. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
Thank you.